Tonight, we are here for a little Hollywood history. I'm excited for this. We are here with Liz Brown. Liz is a journalist based in Los Angeles. She has written a new book called The Twilight Man. And this is a fascinating story of romance, intrigue, mental health conundrums. It has a lot of newsworthiness. If any of you are following the Free Britney movement out there, I'm sure you are, like me, especially if you grew up in the 80s when Britney was the pop star to follow. There's some tie-ins to the history that Liz talks about in her book. All right, if you have any questions come up while we're talking, you can type those into the chat. We'll do a little question and answer from the audience. If you would like to speak with Liz, you can raise your hand or you can type your question into the chat and I'll moderate those at the end. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Liz Brown has written reviews and essays for Book Forum, Elle Decor, London Review of Books, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times Book Review, and many other publications. She is an award-winning journalist. She has received the Brown Foundation Fellowship and also the prestigious Annenberg Research Grant. As I stated before, she lives in Los Angeles. She just wrote a fascinating piece that you can find up on slate.com, that Free Britney connection. All right, Liz, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad we could book this. I'm happy and excited to know about this book and to hear more about it. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How shall I jump right in and tell you?
Yeah, for people that don't know about the book, let's talk a little bit about the main character, the tycoon, Mr. Clark. And if you want to set the stage a little bit for where this takes place, I think that would be a good place to start.
Sure. Well, I mean, it has a kind of it has a lot of LA history, a lot of early Los Angeles history, but in the real scale arc of the book, it actually begins in Montana with the copper mining, with the copper mining tycoons from the Gilded Age, namely William Andrews Clark Sr., who was considered one of the copper kings of Montana, who before Montana was even a part of the Union, when it was still a territory, was being carved up by a handful of men who were basically hoarding the resources and controlling the operation, these vast operations, specifically in Butte, Montana, especially in Butte. And then so in a way I see the book is a story of a man, and it's also the story of an empire or a fortune. So the Clark family and the Clark fortune comes from Montana. That's the empire. And the central character is in some ways I think of him as sort of a kind of forgotten courtier of that empire. He was the secret lover of the heir to that fortune. And his name is Harrison Post. The heir to that fortune was William Andrews Clark Jr., who founded the Los Angeles Philharmonic. He didn't found the Hollywood Bowl, but he bankrolled the LA Phil performing there, and he gave them $50,000 in 1924 to kind of build out their acoustics. And so he had this huge hand in early Los Angeles, but he's completely, I shouldn't say he's completely unknown, but if you compare him to, say, J. Paul Getty or Henry Huntington or Doheny, his name just isn't prevalent in the same way.
We can get back to that a little bit later. I'm sure there's probably some reasons why he isn't as well known as some of those early philanthropists like Getty. Tell us a little bit about how Clark and Harrison Post, who actually has a different name, how did they meet?
Sure. So Harrison Post was born Albert Weiss Harrison, and he was a shop clerk in a kind of luxury emporium in San Francisco in the 19 teens. And they met William Clark Jr., who I call him Will Clark. He had lots of different names. The family called him Junior, but Harrison called him Will. And so that was the choice I made in the book, was just to call him by that name. So Will came into the store sometime in 1919, right after actually the flu epidemic. They met, and he swept Harrison. At that point, he was still Albert Harrison, and he swept him off to LA when he was just about to launch the Philharmonic. And Albert Harrison went from Albert Harrison to Harrison Post, and suddenly he has servants. You know, he was a shop clerk. Now he has servants. Now he has a villa, a ranch, a beach house. So he kind of has, think of him sort of like a gay Great Gatsby who suddenly kind of turns into this fabulous, swanky host, socialite host in a way.
Nice. Truly a rags to riches story, his love story. Tell us a little bit about what these two guys did in their spare time. Do you have any juicy stories about the kind of life that they were leading as a couple?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that Will Clark had 13 portraits of Harrison painted on the ceiling of the library he built in Los Angeles, which is now part of UCLA. And if you go in, you look up, and it looks like, you know, something aspiring maybe to be Michelangelo, and with these very beefy, muscular, naked men, all kind of in different contortions, but they all have different bodies. They were all different models, but they all have the same face, and they're all Harrison's face. So they did not leave a trove of personal correspondence. So because it was illegal for them to be gay and for them to have this relationship. So that was one of the challenges in terms of telling the story, because they very purposefully erased a lot of traces, but they left these other traces that, if you know to look up at the ceiling, are there in plain sight. But their life was filled with, you know, traveling to Europe, lots of this sort of like this just incredible amount of wealth that they had, you know, polo ponies, Rolls Royces, things like that. There's a very scandalous tell-all that was written in the 40s by a disgruntled former employee who says that the villa that Harrison had opposite the street from Will Clark's house, because they didn't live together, they kept separate residences across the street from each other, but that the villa was the scene of indescribable orgies. So that's the juiciest, that's kind of one of the juiciest tidbits there is, but the orgies were not described, unfortunately.
What other kinds of surprises did you find? What was the most surprising thing about your research? And why don't you tell us a little bit about what that included? Where did you do research for this project?
I should say that I came to this story because my grandmother was the niece of William Clark. So I had this personal connection to the story. Her aunt was Will Clark's second wife. And she died in 1918. Harrison appears in 1919. It does seem not that there was overlap between those relationships, but that Will was most likely stepping out with gentlemen before Harrison. But I knew of this, somewhat of this story, of that there was this kind of scandalous backstory to her wealthy uncle. So, but I would say one of the most surprising things for me was after I started the very initial research, I began thanks to the Clark Library here in LA, which Will founded, which has the aforementioned 13 naked men on the ceiling. um, one of the librarians had said, oh, you should talk to this woman in the Bay Area named Sue. She has some kind of connection to Harrison Post. And so I called Sue, and she said, I was living on the East Coast. I was in New York at the time. And she said, you know, yeah, there were all these whispers about Harrison. No one would talk about him. I think it was because of the gay thing, you know, but I have these journals. If you're ever out here, come, you know, stop by. So basically I was out there in about 2 weeks, and just open these journals, which are extraordinary, and they detail his time in Norway, which was another major plot twist in his life, where he ends up in the late 30s, right as the Nazis invade, and he gets trapped and incarcerated. And these journals are written before his incarceration and after, and they're really extraordinary. And there are all these scrapbooks that have him in, you know, with his movie star friends and on his horses, and are just kind of an incredible window into the past and into this very strange story. There's an address book with Greta Garbo's address in it. But the most surprising thing in that moment was Sue was asking me kind of what, you know, about my connection and trying to kind of place me. And I said I'd been born in San Francisco, but that I had grown up in Northern California, in Chico, north of Sacramento. And she said, was your father a professor at Chico State? And I said, yes. And she said, I know your family. I've met your parents. A very good friend of hers, is a friend of my parents. They'd gone to college together. And so she just said, I know you can take everything.
Amazing.
And that was when I knew I had a book. You know, before then I was thinking maybe this is an essay or an article or something. But having those documents. So that was just in terms of the kind of serendipity. There was just a lot of uncanny moments in this process. That definitely was a big one.
Did you make any travels back to any of your family's homelands to do any more exploring about your great uncle?
Sure. I went to Montana, and that was mostly to Butte, although he had a kind of compound on Salmon Lake, a few hours away, which is where he ended up dying in 34. And I went to Norway, so to kind of retrace Harrison's trajectory there. And it's interesting. I mean, the Clarks are, they in some way, well, Clark Sr. definitely kind of created Montana. I mean, carved it out. There were a few copper barons, but he and Marcus Daly were two of the major ones. And I think there's a certain level of respect just for what they accomplished and the scale of their wealth, but they also were greedy people who kind of carved up and owned the state in a way like kings. And in that sense, there's also a kind of, I would say there's an ambivalence a bit about them. They're not lauded, certainly Clark is not lauded as necessarily a deeply beloved figure, but a deeply significant figure, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the character of Harrison. What was his fate later in life? You don't have to give the whole story away, but what kind of a life did he lead toward the end of the life of his lover, who did die before him?
Yeah, so they met in 1919, and Will Clark died in 34. So they had about 15 years together. And and he kind of, he transformed himself from this sort of shop clerk into a kind of Hollywood socialite, and he would host big parties, and but he had one very odd health incident, which was in 1931. He was at a polo luncheon and everyone got food poisoning. It's almost laughable because it was like 30 Hollywood socialites throwing up from bad chicken a la king. But everyone else recovered except Harrison, who ended up having this severe paralytic reaction to the poisoning.
Wow.
And it was temporary, but it was really severe, and it seemed to leave a kind of, I don't know if he had a stroke. It's not entirely clear what the extent of it was, but he ended up hospitalized for a while, and then somewhat in fragile health after making a recovery. So Will was very aware of that as he was as he prepared his, as he was thinking about the future, and he set up a trust for Harrison in the event of his own death, that Harrison would have, knowing that he had this fragile health, that Harrison would have a very secure financial situation. And when Will died from a heart attack pretty suddenly in 1934, Harrison had been convalescing from some kind of breakdown or stroke. And his sister, whose name is Gladys, swept in and had him declared incompetent. Very, very much reminiscent of what has taken place with Britney Spears. And he did seem to have a level of that he did need someone to kind of manage his affairs. She proceeded to sell off his property, his books, his silver, his antiques, his horses, his cars. She ended up dissolving the trust, and so I don't know that I would say she left him destitute, but she definitely left him desperate, and he ends up trying to escape her in a way with the help of one of his male nurses. So that is that is where one of the biggest kind of swerves in his story happens. He writes this thing where he says, in 1934, my life snapped. And this is that moment, when Will dies and when his sister takes over. And then a couple years later, he with the help of this nurse, kind of escapes to Norway. They think they escaped to Norway. And they do, but that's also when the Nazis invade.
This guy had so many twists and turns to his life. Harrison Post, rags to riches to not quite so rich anymore. And then he finds himself right there in Nazi Germany at the end.
Yeah.
How did he end up living to be an old man?
Sadly, no. He did survive the war, I will say that, but his story is a tough one. I mean, it's not it's really a story about greed and about this enormous wealth he stepped into, and this enormous empire, the Clark Empire, and who that attracted. And he does survive the war, but in a way he doesn't kind of survive the betrayal of his sister. He comes back and he tracks her down, and I don't want to give too much more away, but it's, in some ways I feel that the story, it was hard to make this, to think of this as a redemptive story. It's hard he doesn't have a satisfying
Mhm.
catharsis or closure to his life, which if this were fiction, I could have created that and found, and given that to the reader. And that was a real challenge in the writing and the kind of conceptualizing of how to tell this story. And it's only been since it's been published and I've gotten responses from people that have started to think the closure just simply, if you want to call it that, kind of comes in the act of witnessing his story, in the act of the reader. This man was erased because he was gay, and because it was a crime to be gay, and that was why it was so easy for people to take advantage of him. And in kind of imparting the story, I feel like that's where there can be some sort of resolution, I guess, that this person just wasn't erased. So
Absolutely. The reporting of his life and of his lover's life. Think about how many other people there probably were during that era. These guys were even out there and part of society, but think about all the other contributions
yeah,
were likely erased because of lifestyle issues or
yeah,
mental health issues.
yeah.
Um, I was reading a little bit in the promotional materials and my preparation for the event that you felt like Harrison Post in this story that you came into it in a maybe particularly challenging or dark time in your own life. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and like what this story means to you on a personal level? Do you mind sharing that with the audience?
No, sure, I'd be glad to. And it's easier to share than say it would have been 10 or 15 years ago. Um, and that is because I had been drawn to this story. I knew my grandmother had this wealthy, uh, possibly scandalous uncle, and I was intrigued by that. But I also, um, I had come out to my parents and told them I was gay, and they had really struggled with it in a very painful way. And that just took a long time for that to go away, for that kind of, we were just in this prolonged impasse. And um and that really was part of the impetus in a way to tell this story, was to kind of find um a way to stay connected to my family, even though my this uncle is not a biological relation. um in a way, since I was struggling with my immediate family, to have this kind of lineage. And I think a lot of gay or queer people don't have that necessarily, or don't know it. Those stories have been so erased or hidden, um, that when you're kind of trying to figure your own story out, you do want to feel connected to the past or feel like you're part of some kind of through line. So that was a big part of that kind of goaded me onto this path, definitely. And then by the time I kind of was in the thick of the book, things had shifted with my parents, and it was interesting because it didn't have that agenda in the same way that I'd had in the beginning, um, which was great for me personally. It, but there were other things that were then challenging, because I was thinking I was going to be rescuing these gay men from, which that still is part of the book, but they're not uh, they're not total. Harrison is a victim, but Will isn't always a victim. Sometimes he's a villain, and
Mm,
um, that was complicated. They're not black and white figures, definitely.
sure. No, they sound very multidimensional as real people are. We've touched on it a little bit. I just want to talk about the idea of legacy a little bit. We've talked about Harrison's legacy, which is a little tragic, honestly. And then we've talked about Will Clark's legacy, kind of touching on that. What do you think the public perception of him is now in Los Angeles? Do you see that that has changed any over time? And what would he have to say about legacy in general or his legacy if he were alive today?
It's a good question. when he died, he had really retreated from, when he meets Harrison, it's part of this like expansive time in his life as a philanthropist. And he's establishing the LA Philharmonic and contributing to the Hollywood Bowl, and he's become this significant rare book collector, which was what wealthy people did. Instead of shooting off into space, they built libraries and collected special editions of Shakespeare and things like that. So he was in this expansive, very outward period. But as time had gone on, he had become the target of a lot of blackmail, of extortion, of the DA, and he was very embattled, and he was also battling pretty severe alcoholism. I think he might have been having mental health issues. He just really is going into a very dark place. And he stopped right before he died. He said he was no longer going to fund the LA Philharmonic, and he left it without an endowment. And it exists today not because of him, but because other people stepped in after his death and shored it up. So I would think the person he is, I think there's sort of two Will Clarks. There's the one who started the LA Philharmonic and the one who abandoned the LA Philharmonic. And the one who started it, I think, would be thrilled at what a cultural institution it is, has become, and what an anchor of cultural life in LA. The one who abandoned it, but I don't know what he would think. But I do feel like his legacy is in the midst of being reevaluated, or I don't even know if it's being reevaluated, maybe evaluated, because he really was a pretty guarded man. He would make these gestures, but he would retreat at the same time. So I feel like his story is, even though it's been a long time, the LA Phil just had its 100th anniversary. I feel like his story hasn't been out there.
What about the stories of some of these other partners of his? Has there been any historical reconstruction of his wives' lives?
It's interesting because not so much. The Clark Library has a wonderful Instagram account that they're doing a great job of really bringing all these different figures back and just posting about, photographs and archival materials and kind of telling little stories. His first wife, Mabel, died very young, right after childbirth. And then his second wife, which is my connection, my great aunt Alice, she was an interesting figure. She was kind of, in a way, she was the big extrovert in their relationship, and she was the one who hosted lots of charities and benefits and things like that, and was very much part of the kind of Red Cross effort during the war. It was kind of, people wrote about her fashion style and things like that. I tried to think, she'd be whatever dress she wore would get written up or something like that.
Kardashian.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. There is a moment where toward the end of the book where the Kardashians do actually show up literally at the mausoleum of Will Clark, where Alice is buried. So you're not far off from that. They are like a kind of they're our contemporary version a bit.
And speaking of the contemporary connections, let's get back a little bit to the Free Britney stuff and the guardianship. So Harrison Post's sister comes along. She becomes the guardian. She kind of rips him off and takes advantage of him. Do you know of other stories? I mean, these are just two examples, but is this a trend? Is this a trend with wealthy? Is this a trend with in Hollywood that we have seen in other cases? or that you've investigated?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I know some loosely. I know the story of Casey Kasem is a pretty grim one, in which his estate was kind of handed off to his kids while he was still alive, though his wife of 30 years was denied that control. I know Sumner Redstone, the Viacom magnate, was, I think, in a similar thing. I mean, but what's interesting though is, I mean, what should be pointed out is those are people in advanced age dealing with dementia, senility,
Impending death in some
yeah.
cases, or critical care.
Harrison was not. He was still a young man, relatively speaking. Britney is a young, you know, she's only 39. So they're not facing, it's not a question of that kind of decline. So they are, and I do think there's definitely been a history of women being declared incompetent. And that's why I think Harrison's story is interesting. It shows you just, if you are considered a marginalized figure in any way, a woman or a gay man, how easy it can be for the state to accept the fact that you lose all autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just having followed this Free Britney thing, I'm fed up with how much she has been forced to work
Yeah.
her butt off over the years.
Yeah.
And it's like, she can do that. You think she's competent enough to do that, but not competent enough to somehow live an adult life.
Yeah.
It's really interesting what happens, I think, when extreme wealth comes in to the picture too.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I should add that's really, I find astounding about the two stories is that
the lawyer connection.
Yeah, that Britney's court-appointed lawyer, who has since resigned, his name is Samuel D. Ingham III, and I know that name, when I read that, I was just floored, because that is, Samuel D. Ingham is the name of the neurologist who declared Harrison incompetent. So Britney's court-appointed lawyer is the grandson of the man who declared Harrison incompetent. And the implications of that are so dark. You know, either this is a kind of dynasty of people who
support this guardianship.
Yeah, or this lawyer saw what was possible based on what his grandfather and an uncle of his also was a neurologist. And
didn't Britney's attorney though say that he didn't really know a whole lot about the Harrison Post case? Didn't he claim that he?
Yeah, he said I mean, I had an email exchange with him, and he said he knew that his grandfather handled juvenile competency, but didn't know anything about the Harrison Post case. But I think I found a news story of Ingham, the grandfather, involved in a starlet. I want to say it was Mae Clark, but I'm not confident. Some Hollywood starlet being declared incompetent, or judged in something about her. So I don't know. He didn't.
There are a lot of examples.
What's that?
I bet there are many more examples. You would just have to think, especially during the studio days when some of those starlets were so heavily manipulated, and
absolutely
they were like pill and alcohol addicts, a lot of them.
Yeah,
I'm just sure there were probably a lot of manipulations going on.
Yeah, I think there were. I don't know that they often, I mean, there's so many stories of people's discovering their careers, their whole savings, and the wealth they created has just been siphoned away by somebody else.
What do you think is the remedy for that? What do you think people like what's Britney gonna do? Do you have any
I feel like the incentive is so questionable. Like, all those, every time they go to court, every single lawyer, whether they're for her or whatever side they're on, everyone is being paid out of her estate. There's no incentive. This whole apparatus is just like feeding off of her.
Mhm.
And that needs to be, my girlfriend was saying if the taxpayers had to pay for this, I don't think it would be happening. I mean, I think that's a very complicated thing to swap out, but it's
There may be more protests.
or to make also to be very but yeah, to take away that incentive to keep these wealthy people
money.
kind of trapped, held hostage, that feels very key. And maybe it's about creating term limits, that instead of
Reevaluations, right? I mean,
yeah,
annual reevaluations or something. I would think that people
and that maybe the default,
people
yeah,
should change.
yeah, I think perhaps the default should be to release people from these, as opposed that you have to prove they still have to remain in it. It seems like the default is to keep them in it as opposed to release them. So
Good point. All right, folks, does anybody have any questions for Liz Brown? Let's move into some questions from the audience. We have a question coming in from Lisa. Why did Will Clark stop funding the LA Philharmonic?
why did he stop funding the LA Philharmonic? Well, I mean, part of it was the Depression so this is 1934. We're still not out of the Depression, even though he is this major, even though he has this incredible amount of wealth, he still was experiencing the effects of the Depression. My theory is just that he was in this kind of period of contraction from having fought all these kind of legal battles, and his son had died very tragically a couple years before in a plane crash, and they had been estranged. His brother had died. I feel like he had just kind of lost, even though Harrison was still alive, but quite ill, he was kind of losing the people that had mattered the most to him in some way. He was getting very fixated on his housekeeper's son in what I think is probably the darkest aspect of his story, in ways that feel reminiscent, say, of, I don't know, someone like Michael Jackson or something, where you're just questioning what exactly is the nature of this relationship. And how much choice does the kid have in what's taking place? So I just think, so I think he stopped funding it because he had lost some money. I also think he just was turning into this very dark inward place.
More reclusive. He wanted to stay out of the public eye with his.
Yeah. It's interesting because the other Clark that everyone knows about is Huguette Clark, who is the subject of Bill Deadman's Empty Mansions that came out about 10 years ago. And she was Will's half sister, and she lived to be 104 and had an enormous $300 million estate that was very similar, became quickly embattled after her death in 2011. And she lived in seclusion in a 1-bedroom hospital room in New York City for the last 20 years of her life, even though she had acres of land in Santa Barbara, a penthouse on Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue, an estate in Connecticut. So there's this kind, I mean, Will's period of seclusion is much shorter, but there is something about this family, they're kind of a little echo of this intense seclusion that happens at the end.